Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For the purposes of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to my friend, the gentleman from Georgia, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purposes of debate only. I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the Rules Committee met and reported a rule, H.R. 491, providing for consideration of H.R. 3494, authorizing intelligence community programs for fiscal years 2019 and 2020, and retroactively authorizing fiscal year 2018 appropriations under a structured rule. The rule provides for 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. The rule self-executes a manager's amendment from Chairman Schiff that makes technical and conforming changes and adds additional language that authorizes the CIA to expand death benefits to cover officers killed abroad. The rule makes in order 31 amendments and provides 1 motion to recommit. Additionally, the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 116-125 and its accompanying resolution recommending that the House find Attorney General Barr and Secretary Wilbur Ross in contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with congressional subpoenas under a closed rule. The rule provides for 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member of the Committee on Oversight and Reform. The rule also provides for consideration of H.R. 49 under a closed rule. The rule provides for 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. Finally, included in this rule is a process for consideration of committee-reported or Senate-passed joint resolutions disapproving of certain transactions under Section 36 of the Arms Export Control Act. This process allows for the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee to call up such a joint resolution 1 day after it is noticed by the majority leader and provides 20 minutes or an hour of debate and a motion to recommit. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, on intelligence authorization, H.R. 3494 authorizes programs at 16 intelligence community agencies and offices, including the Director of National Intelligence, the CIA, the Department of Defense, the DIA, the National Security Agency, and the FBI. This authorization prioritizes the intelligence community's collection and analytic capabilities against hard-target countries such as China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This bill will help us better understand and counter Russian interference in our elections. It requires reports to Congress on the intentions and designs of Russian political leadership with respect to potential military action against NATO members and on the most significant Russian influence campaigns taking place around the world. This bill also creates a Climate Security Advisory Council to ensure that the intelligence community prioritizes the threat of climate change. Specifically, the bill requires analysts to incorporate climate change into intelligence analysis and encourages collaboration with executive branch departments focused on climate policy. Finally, this legislation takes care of our intelligence community workers by providing 12 weeks of paid parental leave for all employees, in addition to the 12 weeks of unpaid leave federal employees are allowed to take under the Family and Medical Leave Act. On contempt, Mr. Speaker, as you know, the Constitution of the United States requires us to conduct a census every 10 years, an actual enumeration of the American people, everyone who is present in the country. Secretary Wilbur Ross engaged in a process in order to add a citizenship question to the census for the first time in 70 years. This was struck down by multiple federal courts because of the blatant violation of essentially every principle of the Administrative Procedures Act. They did not conduct notice and comment, they did not assemble substantial evidence, and they did not provide a reasoned justification for why they wanted to do this completely outside of the process that had been set up under the Census Act that had been running for several years. And on June 27th, the Supreme Court found that the Commerce Department's argument for including the citizenship question in the 2020 census was contrived, according to Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote, "Several points taken together reveal a significant mismatch between the Secretary's decision and the rationale he provided." Now, my Democrats on the Oversight Committee have been raising questions about Secretary Ross's proffered justification for several years now. We started asking questions back in 2017. Secretary Ross had testified that the Department of Justice letter that he received was the basis for changing the policy and imposing a citizenship question on the census. He said this was that this change was solely motivated by the Department of Justice's request. But in fact, overwhelming evidence has surfaced completely contradicting this account. We know from multiple different sources now that this was a political effort designed to promote the electoral plans of the GOP. The gerrymandering mastermind of the Republican Party, Thomas Hofeller, was the one who first raised this question several years ago. It was talked about during the Trump campaign. It was talked about within days of the inauguration, and we have substantial evidence suggesting that Wilbur Ross, as Secretary of Commerce, was shopping around for a justification for doing this when the motivations were nakedly political. The Oversight Committee began its investigation into the administration's decision to add the citizenship question on March 27, 2018. Yet, the majority of the committee has been stonewalled at every turn by the Departments of Justice and Commerce, which have refused to turn over key documents requested by the Oversight Committee, even after the committee, its members and staff have worked diligently to resolve the impasse by narrowing the scope of the request to a very small subset of documents. We know exactly the documents we need, and yet still we get nothing but defiance, obstruction, and stonewalling from this administration. Democrats requested documents from the Department of Commerce on April 4, 2018. None of the requested documents were submitted. January 8, 2019, Chairman Cummings renewed the request, and the Commerce Department responded by providing thousands of pages of documents, most of which were already publicly available or completely irrelevant or non-responsive or heavily redacted. February 12, 2019, Chairman Cummings renewed the request for documents again, this time identifying a specific memo and note from the Department of Commerce to the DOJ. The DOJ did not provide the requested documents, but rather produced several other documents that were heavily redacted and off point, and so on and so forth. Mr. Speaker, this is intolerable. The Congress of the United States has a constitutional duty to conduct a fair census. 6 former Census Bureau directors wrote a letter denouncing the imposition of this citizenship question and telling Wilbur Ross that this would lead to a far less accurate account. The chief scientist of the Bureau of the Census testified that this was going to overlook and undercount as many as 6 million Hispanic Americans. And we know that potentially millions of other Americans, too, would not be counted. The purpose of adding this citizenship question was not to get a more accurate count. It was to get a far more inaccurate account. And all of the census experts agree with that. So, we have an act, the Census Act, which was violated and ignored. We have the Administrative Procedures Act, which was violated and ignored. And now we've issued a series of subpoena requests to the Departments of Commerce and Justice in order to get the information about what really took place. And again, we are being defied, ignored, and essentially belittled by the executive branch of government. And I want to close my remarks on this with this point. The Constitution begins with the beautiful phrase, "we the people," in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and so on, do create this Constitution in this country. And the very next sentence says that all the legislative powers are vested in us. In other words, the powers of the people flow right through the preamble of the Constitution into Article 1. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly said, along with other federal courts, that integral and essential to the lawmaking function is the fact-finding function of Congress. James Madison said, "Those who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives." The people armed us with that power by creating the legislative function in Congress. But we can't legislate and we can't govern if we can't get the information that we need, which is why the Supreme Court has repeatedly emphasized our power is broad and it is expansive. And our friends across the aisle, they know that. They know that from their Benghazi hearings that went on for years and spent tens of millions of dollars. They know that from the inquiry into Hillary Clinton's emails and so on. Congress has the power to get the information that it wants. And the census is serious business, Mr. Speaker. It goes right to the heart of who we are as we the people. Every 10 years, the founders told us we've got to go back and count everybody up in order to conduct the reapportionment process and decide how many members of Congress are granted to each state. And then hundreds of billions of dollars follow in the wake of the census. And so we've got to make sure that every person is counted. And what we had was this rear guard sneak ambush attack on the census. They got caught doing it. The courts blew the whistle. The Supreme Court blew the whistle. But we want to know precisely what happened to make sure it doesn't happen again, to make sure that there's been no damage, and to make sure we can go forward with a real census. If you act with contempt of the Congress, if you act with contempt for the Congress, if you act with contempt for the American people, we will find you in contempt of Congress and the American people. We are given no choice. Finally, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, on the resolution condemning the President's recent remarks. Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States told 4 Americans who are members of Congress to go back to the countries they came from. 3 of them, Representatives Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, are native-born Americans. And one of them, Representative Ilhan Omar, was born abroad. Mr. Speaker, this is an affront not just to 4 American citizens who are members of Congress. It is an affront to 22 million naturalized American citizens who were born in another country and made the journey to America and made the journey to becoming full-blown, equal, and free American citizens. 22 million American citizens. Indeed, if you think about it, it's an affront to the hundreds of millions of Americans who understand and love how American democracy and citizenship work. We are not a nation defined by race and blood, as the neo-Nazis and Klansmen chanted in Charlottesville as they marched down the street terrorizing the people of Charlottesville. We are defined by our Constitution, which belongs to all of us. And we are defined by the patriotism and by the service of our people. Is there something wrong with being a naturalized citizen under our Constitution, Mr. Speaker? No, there is not. This is something to be honored and celebrated. All Americans are equal in the eyes of the law. This is the meaning of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. We have no kings here. We have no queens here. We have no titles of nobility. We have no monarchy. We have no taints of blood. We have no hereditary offenses. We have no racial caste system. We have no slaves, and we have no slave masters. It is true that there are those in our history who have wanted America to be defined as a white man's compact. And that is indeed precisely what the Supreme Court found it was in the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857. President Lincoln, a great and glorious Republican president, rejected the Dred Scott decision from the beginning as the product of a racist ideology and a racist political conspiracy. And it took a civil war, the blood and the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of Americans to defend the Union and to guarantee the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to overthrow and destroy the Dred Scott decision and the poisonous idea that America is a white man's compact. It is not. All persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States, we said in the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection of the law to all persons who are here. All of us are equal, whether you are a naturalized citizen who was born in Ireland, as our colleague Congressman Sean Casten was, or in Ecuador, as our colleague Debbie Mercalzo-Powell was, or Mexico, as our colleague Chuy Garcia was, or France, as our good friend and colleague Mark Meadows was, or Thailand, as our colleague Tammy Duckworth was, or Guatemala, as our colleague Norma Torres was, or Taiwan, as our colleague Ted Lieu was, or Canada, as our colleague Ted Cruz was, or Poland, as our colleague and author of this resolution, Tom Malinowski was. If these Americans, and many more like them, we have 49 foreign-born members of Congress. We have 29 foreign-born members of Congress. If these Americans, and many more like them, don't belong in Congress, tell it to the millions of people who elected them. And tell it to the founders of our country, who specifically said that you can run for the House of Representatives if you are a naturalized citizen, if you have been naturalized for 7 years, or you can run for the Senate of the United States if you're a naturalized citizen, if you have been naturalized for 9 years. Mr. Speaker, to tell naturalized American citizens to go back to the countries they came from is nativist and antithetical to everything that America stands for. It is the opposite of what we believe about the values of the country. To tell native-born American citizens who are people of color to go back to the country they came from is antithetical to everything we stand for, and it will be up to the House of Representatives today to determine whether or not that is a racist statement. I reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I don't want to put any pressure on you, Mr. Speaker, but it comforts me to see you in the chair up there today. There are those days where you need particular leaders to be there at a particular time, and I will tell you that I'm not telling anybody in this chamber anything they don't already know.